Texas has been active recently. Attorney General Ken Paxton has been clearly prioritizing privacy, showing that they have a well-staffed team in Texas that are investigating matters, they're sending out violation letters, and they're taking enforcement decisions. The TDPSA, or the Texas Data Privacy and Security Act, came into force just last summer, but already we're quickly seeing that this is one of the main tools that the Attorney General is using to enforce Texan data privacy. And we saw this on January 13th when the AG's office filed a lawsuit against Allstate and its subsidiary Arity for allegedly collecting, using, and selling the geolocation and movement data of Texan drivers. This case involves privacy issues like a lack of clear privacy notices, consent, and opt-out options. Or in other words, Allstate encouraged third-party app developers to install a software development kit, an SDK, in their mobile apps. These apps then analyze driving data for certain kinds of behaviour, and Allstate went on to sell that data to third parties. They didn't really provide consumers with reasonable notice for the collection and sale of their data, and they didn't give them a way to opt out. And remember, this was sensitive data too, which requires affirmative consent for processing under the TDPSA. There are a lot of potential privacy concerns here when it comes to driving data and connected cars, so it's not surprising to see enforcement targeting driving data collection. And Texas is definitely going to be a state to watch for continued strong privacy enforcement actions. This case likely sets a precedent for future enforcement actions too, both in Texas and throughout the rest of the US.
Data brokers in the US have been a very interesting case just because they are kind of on the periphery of consumers' minds, just because they don't ever really interact with them, and the laws kind of followed suit, where there's some indirect regulations we've seen in the start with comprehensive laws having a lower threshold for data brokers. However, we're not really seeing too many significant direct requirements on them until like 2018, when Vermont passes a registration requirement, basically saying that if you're a data broker operating in the state, you have to register with the government. 3 other states followed suit, Texas, Oregon, and California. Same structure, same idea. Not really too intensive for them to do. Not really going to change their business model. However, we're seeing a huge development with California's Delete Act that actually may threaten the data brokers law's business model, because they're going to be required to have a mechanism that is very easy for the consumer to use that will require the data broker to delete all the information they have about them.
It's easy to get confused about this, especially because exemptions often differ from law to law. But essentially, entity-level exemptions apply to an entire organization. If a business qualifies for an entity-level exemption, it means the entire business is exempt from complying with certain state privacy laws. This usually takes place when an organization is already subject to a law that limits how they can process personal data. You'll see this a lot of times with financial institutions or healthcare providers. Certain financial institutions that are already regulated by Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, or GLBA, have exemptions from state-level privacy laws, or could. And then healthcare companies are often regulated by HIPAA, so they can often have exemptions as well at the entity level. But the data protected by the GLBA or HIPAA is kind of narrow: healthcare data or financial data. An organization subject to those laws probably processes a lot of data outside of which is protected by those. That's why some state-level privacy laws apply a data-level exemption for those organizations. So what that means is that only the data that's protected by laws like the GLBA or HIPAA is exempt, not the entire organization. So they'll still need to comply with the privacy law for the data that falls outside of the scope of the GLBA or HIPAA. If we look at California's Consumer Privacy Act as a good example, they provide data-level exemption for GLBA-covered organizations, and they offer entity-level exemption for organizations covered by HIPAA.
So even if there's no third-party cookies on your website, but you'll still use first-party cookies to collect additional information from the user, there will likely be a need for consumer consent management. This is based on region. However, they're very similar. Anything above a central cookie, when you start like usage data, trying to figure out what they're looking at, that's when you would need additional OK from the user. The difference between a third-party cookie and a first-party cookie is mainly just who's doing this activity, because a first-party cookie can do anything a third-party cookie can do. However, it just wouldn't be shared externally.
There's been a trend of sort of repurposing these older laws to enforce data privacy when it comes to newer technology and to keep up with newer technology. Federally, you see lawsuits using the Video Privacy Protection Act, or VPPA, and on a state level, you see suits using various wiretap laws like the California Invasion of Privacy Act, or CIPA. Law firms, from what we're seeing, are arguing that tracking pixels violate these laws. When you access a website that uses a tracking pixel, these pixels send your information back to a server, or oftentimes third parties. A lot of times, for instance, we see cases involving Meta's tracking pixel. For VPPA cases, we see examples of companies providing streaming video content on their website and use a tracking pixel for that video. VPPA was originally meant to keep consumers' video rental history private, but now anyone who streams online videos can be considered a video service provider under VPPA. For CIPA and other wiretap lawsuits, you can be sued if you just use the tracking pixel on a resident of a state with a wiretap law. It's not what you might consider wiretap, but that's how these laws are being used, they're being interpreted, and you have to be careful. So there's a few things that you can do to combat these or work around these laws, right? Understand what technologies your site uses. If you use a tracking pixel, if you don't know what tracking pixels you're using, you can't reduce the associated risk. Be transparent with your users about what you collect and what tracking pixels you use, and make sure you're getting explicit consent for that type of tracking. It's also good to, anytime you can, minimize the tracking pixels that you use. If you don't need it, make that consideration from a business perspective.